All right, everybody, welcome back to the last afternoon of the EOCP's 2022 conference. We're here in the leadership stream, and this afternoon we're going to be talking about cybersecurity. We've got a panel for you. The panel is going to be led by Lauren Zabarek. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She is the acting executive director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and the executive director of the center's cyber project. She comes to the role as a 2019 graduate from the Kennedy School's mid-career MPA program. Here she runs a policy development, cybersecurity, and technology policy research program with students and non-resident fellows. Her work focuses on strategic national security issues in cyber and tech, ranging from international conflict, cooperation, and norms to domestic collaboration, diversity, privacy, and supply chain issues. Lauren is also the co-founder of the online social media movement called #ShareTheMicInCyber, which aims to dismantle racism in cybersecurity and privacy. Our panel today consists of local experts from BC. Bart Nielsen at MPE Engineering is on our panel. Bart is a senior control systems specialist and the team lead in MPE's Nanaimo office. He values his early days in his career when he started out as an operator, as that background has provided him experience like no other when building control systems. These days Bart coordinates projects, helps municipalities bridge the gap between operational technology and information technology. He writes proposals, teaches courses, and still does a little bit of programming. Krista Derrickson is an experienced technical officer with a demonstrated history of working in the utilities industry. She is skilled in nonprofit organizations, negotiating, budgeting, business, planning, and analytical skills. She is also a strong support professional with an environmental science certificate focused on environmental science from CIER. And then last but not least on our, we got two more panel members. I'll introduce you first, Peter. So Peter Henkelman, he works with me up in Squamish. Peter's worked his entire career in electrical technology, hardware, software, and networking. Most recently, he's been working for the District of Squamish the last 5 years, leading the automation charge. He works on our SCADA system, communications, and electrical technology. Previously, Peter worked for a large organization that most of you know as Whistler Blackcomb. For about 25 years, he spent building their SCADA system, he's a certified electrician as well, so building their SCADA system for their snowmaking and lift operations, and we managed to snap him up. He's a designer, programmer, administrator, and industrial electrician. He has direct experience with many network vendors, many SCADA software packages, cyber concerns, and issues. The rest remains a secret, as it should, considering that this is in regards to critical infrastructure. And lastly, we have Mark Filoria. Mark has a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. He is an APEG BC member and a PMI member. He's currently the manager of water distribution for water supply services with the City of Abbotsford. Previously, he was Director of Operations and Maintenance at Interjex Renewable Energy and a manager of water production at the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority. All right, I will hand it over to Lauren and we'll get started.
All right, thanks everyone. I really appreciate it. I am not sure if my bio was read or anything like that, but I am Lauren Zabarek. I am the executive director of the cyber project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, but I'm also acting executive director for the entire center right now. And it's my pleasure to speak with you today about this issue, and I hopefully we have some really good questions and discussions lined up. So Thank you for introducing everyone prior to this, so that gives us a little bit more time to jump into the discussion. So let me set the stage, and then I will have questions for the different panelists. So last year, a joint advisory was released by CISA, our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, FBI, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the sector risk management agency for water and wastewater, and the NSA, detailing ongoing threats to the operational technology and information technology systems by known and unknown threat actors to US water infrastructure. And of course, the ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline last year really brought the threat of ransomware into sharp focus for much of the general public and for policymakers, and hopefully, you know, we'll start to really turn the tide here on you know, the fight against cyber criminals that are targeting the underpinnings of society. But ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure, including water and wastewater resources, are not new. For example, ransomware impacted the Lansing Board of Water and Light in 2016, the North Carolina Onslow Water and Sewer Authority in 2018, and Riviera Beach in Florida in 2019. And then, of course, we had the Oldsmar, Florida incident as well. Water and wastewater entities, like many critical infrastructure organizations, such as factories or oil pipelines, are really at high risk of exploitation from cyber threat actors focused on ransomware. And despite the, you know, very patches available for, you know, for many vulnerabilities that are exploited by these threat actors, fixing them really, you know, and improving overall cybersecurity posture really takes a lot of commitments in time and human resources and finance. And so many critical infrastructure organizations, including those responsible for distribution of and the safety of our water systems, are, you know, are struggling with that. So, but as we know, disruptions to water and wastewater IT and OT systems could be catastrophic. And so, you know, we know that threat actors are increasingly targeting critical infrastructure, or at least seeking to disrupt those services at the very least, and maybe even to instill fear in the citizens, you know, throughout our different countries. And of course, the low barrier to entry and the distributed capabilities, which are often for sale on the dark web, really mean that non-state actors who don't abide by these international law and norms are in the game and can use the cyber domain to achieve their financial goals. So the line between state and non-state cyber actors is increasingly blurred, which leads to more sophistication among cyber criminals. And right now, there are no cybersecurity regulations for water and wastewater, despite, you know, these vulnerabilities. And in 2021, the Water ISAC State of the Utility Report really made clear the state of the cybersecurity efforts. I'm sure many of you read that report, but you know, there's a lot of work to be done, I'll just say. I believe, as the National Cyber Director in the United States believes, that we cannot rely on market forces to protect individuals. And I think we need to reframe the debate on cybersecurity regulations. But I really want to explore that disconnect. And I really want to understand the forces at play preventing the adoption of cybersecurity standards, especially for operational technology. So I am definitely not the smartest person in the room on this. I'm not even in the room. But I really want to hear from the experts doing the work at the front lines of these operations instead of you all listening to me. So with that, I will start with my questions. So obviously, there's a huge gap to bridge between where I sit looking at national security policy and my panelists here who are at the front lines of operating water and wastewater utilities. So we'll do our best here. Bart, let's start with you. Can you please paint a picture of what operators are really dealing with when it comes to cybersecurity?
Maybe, as I'm not an operator, but used to be. From an operational perspective, I think the first thing that operations are dealing with is an unknown, something that's potentially out there that is hard to grasp, and how it really impacts operations on a day-to-day. I think that that's the first thing that we need to overcome, is to start talking about this, to have operations guys ask questions to their superior, to their IT people, whether that's within a municipality or a consultant, and to have these conversations and make it normal. I think that we are all, stepping away from work. We all know cybersecurity is a thing. We know that we have antivirus on our computer at home, and we see that those get patched, and we have accepted that, and we deal with that. I think we need to stretch that into the regular, ongoing routine of operations, and make that normal as part of their job. So, like I said, I think that it needs to start with a little bit of education. Lots of questions back and forth to bridge that gap, to make it a normal thing before we can actually tackle or get a municipality to address cybersecurity. So those are my first thoughts immediately.
Okay. Yeah, and let's pull on that thread a little bit. And anyone here, if you want to jump in, what is sort of preventing that education? What's preventing people from asking questions? Is it, just we need more of a baseline level of awareness about the issue? Or because you mentioned, they're dealing with the unknown, right? Something's out there. So what needs to happen here? Especially for the people on the front lines.
Well, if nobody else jumps in, I'll continue. I believe that we need to make this a normal topic of conversation. And I don't think that that's happening right now. I think that the world of OT, operational technology, operations guys, they very frequently have their hesitation having conversations with IT savvy people, because it's English, but it's not necessarily the same language. Having said that, those conversations can be facilitated by somebody who understands both worlds. And sometimes that's not even necessary, because an IT guy does speak English, and you can continue to ask questions when terms come up about firewalls and routers and all of these fancy devices that are installed in your facility, but you don't actually know quite what they do and what they mean. I really encourage people to continue to ask those questions. What does a firewall do, and how does it impact me? Why do we need one? And I think that if we have that level of understanding, then we can start talking about, okay, how do we now, from a cybersecurity perspective, get to the next step? How do we implement some policies and some procedures, and how do we, as a municipality, become more secure? So I think a lot of it is education.
Got it. Krista, as a manager of utility operations, what kinds of cyber threats to utilities are you seeing?
So I was just going to add to that, which is actually acknowledging the fact that it's a reality. So most operators, I'm an operator first before I became a manager. Cybersecurity is something that you worry about when it's your personal information. It's not as big of a topic amongst operators as attacks within our systems. We have a contractor who has recently, like in the last 12 months, has stopped an attack, but they don't think it was an attack on our system. It was just somebody trying to hack in and steal our internet. But without having a third party involved, we probably would have never known, because as an operator, we're not trained in how to protect our equipment that's remote. We kind of leave that up to a contractor. But if that's not a conversation that you're having with your contractor or your SCADA provider, it's not something that's really being looked at. And so it's a big gap, not only for us, but for consultants. And right now there is no interlink between our in-house IT, who protects our government or our municipalities, and our service providers that deal with water and wastewater, because usually those are two separate groups. And just kind of bringing those two groups in to have a conversation, and then once they've had a conversation, then bring operators in to help them understand what they're doing that potentially is putting the system at risk, I think would be kind of the better way to start it. Because as an operator, I don't want to learn about cybersecurity. I know enough technical stuff. I don't want to become a computer programmer. That's not what I got into operations for. So having somebody that's what they live and breathe, have a conversation with somebody else that's what they live and breathe, and then explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old, that's kind of what I would prefer. And then also the need to increase the education within leadership to understand that this actually is an issue and that it's not something that operations should deal with, that there is actually funding that's required in order to get these groups to talk.
Great. Anyone else on, on the front lines of water and wastewater operations? What sorts of threats are you seeing? Maybe Mark, if you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, it's just because that the frontliners, the operators, they are more on the tangible part of the equipment, like the pumps or PRBs or anything related to relay, electrical, and stuff like that. But behind that, there's a program that runs all of this, and that needs to be protected as well, right? And for that, what Bart said, it needs to have some education on how this programs needs to be protected through cyber interference or sabotage or something like that. That operators need to know that's how our system functions together within that program, and that needs to be protected. The other thing that I would like to say is the assets that we have needs to be evaluated carefully before we could actually move in and do a further assessment on what we need to do for our cybersecurity.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point. In the Water ISAC State of the Utility report, it was a certain percentage of respondents who had actually done an assessment of their OT and IT networked assets, right? So do you then think that's, what's the issue there? Is it, lack of time, lack of resources, or what do you think about that?
As I said, it's all about education and then leveling up to that. Because in the idea of like an operator's point of view, if something fails, they also always move to like, oh, I could operate it manually. Where you've actually invested into something bigger and expensive, such as a cyber network or a PLC or a SCADA system, that also needs to be protected. So in terms of identifying assets, that's the first thing that I think we all have to do as municipalities, to identify all the assets related to cyber equipment that we have, and then we categorize this based on criticality.
Gotcha. So there seems to be sort of a, this disparity, I guess, in awareness and really the capacity to build that awareness, right? Between, personal time and how do we even get that? What resources do we bring in to actually educate and create awareness, among different employees? So very interesting. Thank you. Peter, I'd like to pivot over to you. Can you talk to us about some of the challenges to security that you see in automation of operational systems?
Yeah, sure. I think it's coming at us, really. A lot of people feel like technology, we're at the behest of it. We don't have control over it. So an important place to start, following up on what Mark was just saying, is the asset, knowing what you've got and knowing that's the way when you can consult with an outside security expert, at least know what your landscape is inside your doors. And that's an excellent starting point. It's important to have a line item to address that too in the budgets so that there's funding available for that. That's,
yeah, and I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit. So I had mentioned earlier, I'm a big proponent of mandatory cybersecurity requirements and standards for IT and OT, but, to your point, may not be as much of a question of what, maybe it is a question of how, right? And so bringing in consultants, because, Bart, for instance, you've mentioned that utilities simply don't know where to start. So I'm wondering if you can sort of unpack that a little bit in terms of what Peter just said.
I think I can. I think that if we, for example, were to be asked to come and help one of our clients become more secure, the first thing we would ask for is, show me what you have. And that's a step that operations can take on. Do an inventory of what's running in your operational network. And I'm talking about not necessarily a flow meter on a pipeline, but anything that is a little bit smarter than that. When you have controllers, you have networks, you have SCADA, you have an HMI somewhere. All of those types of devices, they should be on a list somewhere. They will probably end up on some sort of a drawing somewhere, and then that drawing will fan it upon with an IT type person who oftentimes has connected or allowed for a connection remotely to that control system. And until you have that picture of what the current state is, you really have a real hard time trying to tackle cybersecurity for your municipality. So from an operational perspective, I believe there is massive value in starting out with that inventory. From there on, certainly, and I mentioned it earlier, you know, from a firewall to a network switch and a router, nobody expects operations resources to be intimate with that type of equipment, to understand where they sit and what functions they have. But the picture and the inventory does need to start at the plant floor.
Gotcha. Anybody on the panel have any response to that? No? Krista, what about you as someone, you know, managing these systems? How would you approach that?
Well, I agree. And most of, like, I will speak for my system. I'm a smaller system compared to most. We would actually rely on our consultant to have the majority of that information because they're the ones that have connected us in. The problem becomes when you have a lot of changeover in your consultant group, or they've changed hands a few times, and it's like, you're kind of relying on them to have all your information. And I know personally we've done kind of a bad job of making sure that all of that information is transferred over to us when there's a bunch of changes. But it's only something that's been newly discussed at the operation level. I'm sure in the IT world, and in the cyber world, it's definitely been something that's been coming. But as far as actual plants and operations, I don't think that we thought that anybody would try and take us over, right? Because what are you going to do? What are you going to do with wastewater or water? But it really takes over the government that controls those systems. So we actually are a very vulnerable place because we don't have all of that information, and it's not something that's in our day-to-day brain of how do we do this. I know when I log into my computer at my office, there's a whole bunch of things that I have to do to ensure that it's safe. When I walk into my plant, I don't have to do any of those things. And that, even just that simple change of treating the plant like it's an office with all of those extra security measures is probably someplace that would be easy to start, because that's the most vulnerable place within our system as far as I can see.
Yeah, and you said something there, you know, that I'd like to pull on a little bit, and that is, you know, that's not something that, you know, for a long time you were thinking about, right? And you know, why would anyone do this? And you know, what happens if those systems go down? So there's been an effort, I think it was in the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, that we had to really come up with a continuity of economy plan, right? So many of you probably, if you've been in, you know, different parts of government or wherever, you've heard of a continuity of operations, and that obviously is very important. But on the continuity of the economy, like if these critical functions go down or fail, what happens next, right? How do we recover from that? And this is something I've been thinking about a lot too. I wrote an article with Juliet Kayyem this past year on sort of reframing the debate on cyber regulations based on this book she wrote on The Devil Never Sleeps, because her you know, her argument is that disasters are going to happen. We live in an age of disaster, and so we need to be prepared for that. And she used the example of the Colonial Pipeline, one of her many examples, because she did work in the Obama administration and DHS. But they didn't, you know, there was no plan, right? So their IT systems were hacked, they were held for ransom, and then they simply just, they were pumping blind. So they shut the whole thing down, and you know, they were without gas operations for several days. And that has real impacts on people. So is this something that you're thinking about too? And I don't know if this is, you know, on the municipality level, on the, you know, province level, things like that, but just the, you know, the incident response, not only on the IT side, but on, you know, let's recover and, you know, get things back online. Like what are some of the, maybe the challenges there that you're thinking through?
Well,
And maybe Mark, or Chris, I'll direct that to you, and then we can.
I think it was kind of mentioned earlier, just that most operations is like, well, I can just override it and operate it manually, which is fine if you're a smaller system, but the larger you get and the more complicated you get, you may not actually have those manual overrides anymore because the industry is going very automated. And one of the concerns with doing that is specifically having a cyber attack where you don't have a manual override and you don't have the people trained to actually step in and understand how that's supposed to work if those automated systems go down. So having kind of a fail-safe in operations is potentially something that could be missing in the future.
Yeah, and not only just on the operational level, but with the town, the city, the province, right? And working through that. So I don't know, Mark or Peter, or is that something that you're thinking through?
Yeah, I just want to share a short story about that. If you guys remember the 2018 Eastern blackout that happened, that was a massive blackout for, I guess, about Ontario got hit, Quebec got isolated, and there's a bunch of states in the US that's been affected heavily. There were no water and cell phone services for 3 days. And the electricity was actually down for about 4 days before they were able to recover. So from that point, they have a sort of labor regulation, but then they up their regulation, they up their game by putting on more detail in the regulation. That incident wasn't due to cyber attack. It was something related to a power failure and a fault that happened in the transmission main. But when the regulation started to go in, they implemented something related to cybersecurity, which is a big part of a mandatory standard now that for all of the power producers or your transmission holder, you should be following those regulations. Part of that is also how to recover back from such attack or something that failed. So it's something that we, by doing some emergency response, maybe that would be a first case. That's a very basic thing that we should all have as a municipality. And the other thing is like investment, as what Peter had said. You have to have that line item and encourage your top management to say, hey, we need to invest on this so we could have a more robust system in terms of like cybersecurity or a backup system, something like that.
Yeah, and you're right. Like it doesn't really matter at the end of the day to an average person if this was from a cyber attack or a power going out or a squirrel eating through a power line, right? It's all about the impact and whether we can recover from it. So thank you for sharing that story. I don't really remember that. I probably should, but I think that's a really useful, story to share about these issues and the real impact that can come out of it.
Well, and to just add to that, like when we had the Rogers outage just this summer, and everybody, over half of the people, didn't have cell phone coverage, one of the things that we became vulnerable as an organization, as a utility, is that we have one service provider for our cell phones. So in that instance, nobody had cell phone coverage. Luckily, we have radios, so we were able to use those. But and our system has multiple different ways of communicating. But one of the things that we're looking into is actually getting rid of a couple of our phones and making sure that we have more than one service provider for work cell phones, so that if one system does go down, another one will still work, because luckily almost all of our personal phones are on different networks. So we're still able to talk to each other as operators, but as an organization, everything went down.
Yeah, and I'm really glad to hear that you had radios, you could use it, and those are things that we have to think through as we're doing this contingency planning. So I hope the people around are sort of taking notes on that. But there's a lot of sort of small things to think through when you're coming up with your continuity plans. So speaking of phones, we have a question from one of the attendees here. They said our organization has an IT policy and a contractor that handles their technical aspects, but we have staff that still use their own personal devices to sign in remotely. So how would you sort of deal with this, like in your organizations, from a policy standpoint, and then what would you do to sort of make sure that your systems are sort of resilient to that ability?
That's a heavily focused IT type question, in my humble opinion. From a SCADA provider perspective, when we provide remote access into a SCADA system, we don't ask specifically for the end device to be a device that is supplied by the municipality, by our client. We provide the functionality to set up a secure connection between our SCADA system and the device that is being used. And there's technology for that we then implement.
Is it an appliance usually you're talking about?
It could be a cell phone, it could be a laptop, it could be anything, to be honest, but it's about the technology that you then roll out on both sides of these two devices that creates that secure connection. It's called a VPN, a virtual private network. By the way, if I can just circle back to the conversation about 3 minutes ago, I think that what we're doing here today is exactly what I alluded to right out of the gate, is to start the conversation. Because we started heavily focused on, operations and this thing about cybersecurity, and all of a sudden we start talking about emergency response. And they're related. And we start talking about even operating procedure. We started talking about redundancy in some of our infrastructure. And all of that stuff is related. So if you look at the current guidelines, because currently there's only guidelines for our Canadian municipality from a cybersecurity perspective, and maybe they're going to run into requirements and mandates. It's a normal conversation to have. And when you start these conversations, all of a sudden you see that there's overlap with some of these areas that we're already dealing with in our everyday. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there. And that's why I think this is a great conversation to have. But to get back to your question about what device, it doesn't really matter as long as it's rolled out and integrated in a secure manner to your control system.
Thanks, Bart, on that. And I agree, having these conversations I think is important, and especially, bringing together the policy people, the, people who are doing the operating and people, who are the technical experts. And that's something that, I'm trying to do, on my end as well. So I truly appreciate that. So you just mentioned the devices, and this is a question that I've had, and, Bart, we've chatted about this too, but I'd like to hear, from the other members as well. Especially you, Peter, the devices, right? So your sensors, your actuators, the things that do actually connect to the internet. I've learned that there really aren't any cyber sort of, standards baked into that. Is that something that you would like to see, the ability to secure those particular devices that are connecting to the internet?
Yeah, really what you're going to start to see is that your in-house SCADA, your server, and that is on a dedicated, really sub-network inside your organization. So it's separate. It's apart from your office and your printers and so on. It needs to be for, you know, that to segregate that, you can at least more easily identify and isolate it if necessary and keep control of that from a security standpoint. So all your devices are connected to that, but the single point of contact ends up being that firewall, which is, you know, it's an appliance or a router that's out at sort of the front, if you will, or the middle, the nexus where you're connected to the internet. And we just, from our own district municipality, we just had one put in a couple of years ago, and that includes the two-factor authentication. So anybody logging in has to be a known person inside the organization. Plus, they're using their personal device as the second factor of identification. So basically, as soon as you're going to log in, you get a thing pop up on your phone, and you're going, okay, that's cool, that's me, and that's I think going to become a minimum standard for outside connection. Otherwise, all your devices should be on the inside of your network. I realize there's the cloud and there's that whole discussion to have. Maybe we'll get into that a little later, but you know, your network needs to be a standalone unit effectively.
Gotcha. Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts on that and how they're thinking about segregating those assets?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. So for the physical assets that you were mentioning, like, you know, valves or pumps, as what Bart was mentioning earlier, however, how much you invest on your cybersecurity, how robust your security is, please lock your doors. So that's the first thing that you need to do, guys. So make sure that your physical assets are secured. So through securement through lock system, like, you know, or put some intrusion alarms on your doors would help you identify, you know, things that are physically attacked as opposed to a cyber attack. So those assets need to be secured properly and not only left them alone unsecured.
It's a really great point. Again, so the fact that incidents and disasters happen, and maybe because of the cyber attack, it may or it may not be. So that's a really great addition there. Any other thoughts from the panel on that at all?
So I know for us, we only allow company-owned equipment to link in to our SCADA system so that we can guarantee that it's protected, and all of our devices have the antivirus protections and stuff. I still think that they're probably the most vulnerable point in our system, but I think that that's one of the ways that we're trying to protect our stuff is by, you can't just use your personal phone to log into our SCADA. You actually can't use a phone to log into our SCADA. It has to be through a computer device to log in, so.
Interesting, thank you. So I'm going to read another question from an attendee here, and I will say I failed to mention at the top of this, if the audience has any questions, please do raise your hand. I'm sure there's some runners in the audience with microphones, or if there's a standing mic, I'd love to hear that. So this anonymous attendee says, you know, the question always comes back to me as, we're just a small plant. We're not even a large enough facility to have a large impact for hackers or terror threats. But this blatant dismissal isn't just my question, but the actual threat to me and our families that rely on us to be able to do our jobs. And it reminds me that this attitude is just part of the threat that is exploited, which is frustrating. I completely agree. I think, you know, a lot of people or organizations might say, well, why would anyone target me, right? You know, I'm not very big or what have you. But it's, you know, obviously there's the psychological part of it, the disruption, and then the real impact on people's lives, even if it's just a small, you know, plant and, you know, however many people it serves, those are still lives, and those lives are still impacted. So I think you're right. I think we shouldn't be dismissing something just, even if it's small. It's, you know, we all have to have this, you know, security and survival mindset. So one, to throw it out to the panel here too, to get your thoughts on that and on how we try to change that narrative from, you know, why would anyone target me? We're very small to no, we need to make sure that this is, you know, a mindset across different organizations.
Well, if you follow that analogy, you would never even bother installing antivirus software on your home computer that is on 24/7, because that's just your own personal computer. And why would anybody bother to put a virus on that? And why would I bother protecting myself against something? Which I hope nobody actually does. I hope that we all do have that antivirus running on our home computer, because there are serious viruses out there that can really upset the way that you operate your tiny little home and how you use your computer. So I believe that ransomware, for example, is a very big one that generates a lot of cash for hackers. And it doesn't necessarily matter if your municipality is large or small. There is money to be made. It might be a different magnitude from a Colonial Pipeline versus a small municipality, but there's still money to be made. So you are at risk. There's no doubt about it.
Well, and I also think that, like, I'm not a hacker at all, but, you know, sometimes they start small to see what they can do. They'll attack something small just to see, how do we get in? How do we learn and grow from this before they go on to somebody bigger? So being small actually could leave you more vulnerable, because there's usually not as much safety protocol involved in smaller systems, which leaves them more open to attacks, which just allows somebody to practice and then grow and go and get somebody bigger, in my mind.
Yeah, and to Mark's point about, you know, locking your systems, right? A lot of it is sort of like someone going through and jiggling the door. Is this open? Is it, you know, unlocked? And you know, sometimes it is just a target of opportunity. Yeah, Mark, do you have any further thoughts on that? Or, you know, how do we change this narrative, especially when you're dealing with, you know, maybe it's a small utility in a municipality, or maybe it's a bigger organization where you have to convince, say, the CEO to actually prioritize these things.
Kalpna also has some questions.
I have a couple of questions from the floor. Did Mark want to go first, or should I go with my questions first?
I'll just answer the question first. Just don't take things for granted, whether it's small or big. You know, just protect your system. That's all I could advise.
Okay. We have a question here from the audience.
Yeah, more of a comment, so I'm going to pass on to management when they want an explanation of why we should have it, that it's ties in with your analogy about locking the building. Like, you wouldn't prop a door open and leave for the day and hope no one goes in there and changes anything. So it's the same with the cyber attack.
Yeah, and in addition to that, would you be comfortable being the municipality that ends up in the news? Ask your boss that one.
That's a great point. And you know, how long did it take you to respond and recover, right? Or do you have a plan? You've been exercising it, you're ready to go, and you're, you know, able to respond and recover quickly.
I have another question here.
It's more of a comment. We don't have the SCADA system up at the university, but what we ended up doing was going to a multi-factor authentication that changes every 2 minutes. And we have either sent to our phone or a little reader that we have. And every time we log on, we have to get that authentication number to use. So I don't know how expensive or the cost on it is, but that's something they could look at. That, yeah, every 2 minutes it changes, so.
And I have one more question.
Hi. We were at a presentation yesterday that was showing instrumentation now that's out in the field and using cloud. And I was a bit concerned with what the security implications are with the cloud. Are these instruments encrypted? You have to have encryption on both sides. You're trusting a third party with that their security is up to snatch, and all of that. You know, I have some reservations with that, even though I love the idea and the convenience of having smart instruments out on your fire hydrants, out, you know, on your flow meters, and getting all this data is terrific. But then we run into the security. What kind of security is out there currently now? I'm assuming this has already been thought of by some very clever people, so.
Yeah, and Bart, I'd love to kick it to you to explore that, because I know you mentioned, going into the cloud aspect, but, I think the different cloud companies like your Amazons, your Googles, your Microsoft, I think are very good, but at the same time, it does also come down to configuring your own sort of cloud environment, and making sure that that is, working as well. But I will also say that this migration to cloud for a lot of different organizations has presented, for lack of a better word, opportunity, right, for actors to start exploiting this from a third party, supply chain perspective. So it has become more of a target. So yeah, I think making sure that your own environments, your instances, right, are protected in a way that is aligns with the importance of the organization. But yeah, Bart, love to kick that over to you too.
Yeah, because I think this question that was just asked was referring to a conversation or a presentation that I happened to put on. So yeah, I can speak to this. I always refer back to, the fact that we rely on third-party solution providers all the time with very personal items. I mean, we can lock and unlock our front door from our home phone, and we have no issues doing that. We do our personal banking sitting here using the Wi-Fi of this hotel, and we have no problems with that, because we've gotten used to it, and we rely on, your Scotiabank, your local RBC or whatever bank you deal with to provide that level of security, as well as the Wi-Fi as it is available right here in this facility. It has taken time for us to adopt to that and no longer physically walk over to your bank and put your check in the machine there, and now you just take a picture of it and we're good with that. I think that from an operational and from an industrial operation perspective, the IIoT, the Industrial Internet of Things, it's a relatively new thing. It's a very new concept, and I completely understand that. But you're right, because there is at some point a level of trust that you're going to have to put into either a vendor or a system integrator or a developer of a protocol that you're going to have to rely on to, in terms of the security of that data, that it's not being compromised and that access cannot be breached. So I believe that it takes a little bit of time. It takes a little bit of getting used to. It's a slightly different way of thinking. Yesterday we had the conversation about, well, what if, and the example came up already, what if your cellular connection goes down? Does that mean I can no longer access my SCADA system? Well, that depends. If that is the only mechanism of you communicating to your SCADA system, which may or may not sit in the cloud, or if you're depending on that one and only communication infrastructure, then yeah, you're out of luck. You're going to drive to your site and you're going to run it in manual if you can, or maybe not can. But it's all about how many layers of redundancy you're going to implement to give you that level of comfort.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on that too, to the person in the audience who asked that question, where you said, I'm sure people have thought about this. I think that, for instance, Bart has thought about this, but from a policy or a law standpoint, I don't think that that's, been something that, has been implemented yet. So at the end of the day, like many things with cyber, it sort of comes down to you and your organization, right? You're where the weakest link, right? You're where the buck stops in terms of, you're the safety and security of your organization and your own personal data too. So
yeah, and you're going to rely on others. You're going to rely on, is it Cisco or HP, that they have done their job right, that they have provided solid firmware that cannot be cracked. You're going to rely on the guy who configured that Cisco or that HP device. So there are so many different factors and layers. The fact that you may end up running your SCADA system in the cloud or may have a device connected to your SCADA system through the cloud is just an extension of that. I can assure you that the protocols and the devices that we've installed in the example that I put in my presentation yesterday are very secure. And a tremendous amount of research has been put into developing those protocols. By the way, the protocol is actually in use by Facebook. Facebook Messenger is using the exact same protocol that is used by the IoT device that can be installed on a reservoir that monitors your level and brings that into your SCADA environment.
But I also think that it's a good thing for us as operations to ensure that we're asking when service providers are creating these new products, and we just think, oh, this is great, but at the back of our mind there's that, but is it safe? And just asking, and maybe having the industry have that as something that they use as a selling feature too, right? It's like, hey, we actually are going to make sure that this is protected if you choose us, right?
100% agree, and this is why I started earlier saying with these types of conversations need to become normal conversations in the world of an operator, because we are using this type of technology now to run our facilities.
To follow up with your question, sir, it's, as Bart said, it's all a level of trust that you have to put in, right? Right now, we all just have to trust whatever service provider you'll be taking, a contractor, consultant, you have to put the trust in them. It's just because that we don't have that mandatory regulation that would protect us from those trusts yet. But if we have those regulations in place, then your mindset would be better, saying that, yeah, even if I trust this guy and he fails to do that, you can go back to that regulation and say, hey, this is what we agreed on. And so, there would be litigation or something like that.
Right, and the mitigation of anything has risk to it, but what are the steps that you could take to mitigate that risk? 1, 2, 3, 4 steps down the road. So, Peter, did you have a comment? I see you read.
I was just going to say, I think you could add to that earlier question about where does a small system operator start, in that there is actually very small firewalls, very modest, not a huge capital outlay, is something that they would fit into their size of operation and would be, a starting point. And it's literally looks like almost a home device, and it can be configured by a systems integrator, which would be really a SCADA integrator working as a security integrator. So there's a starting point for sure, and that would perhaps also answer the cloud question, because there could be rules put in that little device. And at least you have something, not nothing. You have that first padlock on the system.
Are you having to, convince leadership of that though, right? To make those investments in those systems, to, convince them that this is actually very important. It's not just a nice to have, it's a need to have. And how are you convincing the leaders of those organizations?
No different than explaining why you need a good lock on your front door and why you need a fence around a certain facility when it's sitting in a public yard. It is no different. And what I do like about some of the guidelines, and again, I use the word guidelines because we don't have any regulations yet, but some of the guidelines that we are currently following to improve cybersecurity are covering all of these types of topics. It talks about physical access, and it talks about backups. Now, backups is not at all related to cybersecurity. Backups are things that anybody should be doing regularly, whether it's even at your home computer. But it is highly related to cybersecurity, so that if there is a breach, if there is an issue, you have tools to get back up and running. So there's a massive overlap between a lot of these everyday types of things. And this is really why I once again, really want to stress on the fact that these are normal conversations that we should just have to explore and stretch a little bit into, hey, maybe we do need a little bit of a firewall, like Peter mentioned, to basically mimic the same thing that we have on our front door.
Yeah, I agreed. I think definitely important conversations to be had, and probably ways to facilitate those conversations more broadly and more frequently as well. Another question we have from the online, I think, is looking downstream at the subject after a successful attack has occurred, what actions would you recommend that an organization take to recover its data and systems?
That's very loaded because without having, knowing the situation, that's a question that is very hard to answer. But I go back to, if it's ransomware, there's clearly money involved that supposedly once transferred over will free up the operation again back to normal. If you listen to anybody in the industry of cybersecurity, you're urged to never transfer money and never buy your way back to the previous state and buy off the ransomware. But if you do that, and if you therefore are looking at a computer that is locked and you can't operate your plant, what is it going to take to get back up and running? So how can you replace that computer? How can you get the software back up and running? Where's your licensing? Is it a software license? Is that available now? Where's your backup? Where's your data? So all of those types of questions would immediately have to be addressed in order to make a decision on how you get yourself back up and running again. And that's why we are starting this conversation about, what mandates, what kind of framework are we collectively in this industry going to follow to get ourselves to that point where we are comfortable if something like this were to happen.
Yeah, and I will say, we wrote an article at the start of the Russian war in Ukraine, about this and sort of the Shields Up campaign that our Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency had implemented. And, the hope is that you're not just creating these contingency continuity plans now, that we have to get them out, dust them off, exercise them. Being vigilant is the new normal, basically. It's not just sort of a one-off thing. This is something that we have to think about every day. Are there any more questions from the audience at all?
Yes, I have one more just over here.
Great.
I just had a comment on Mike's concerns that I think we live in a remote geographic area in Whitehorse in the Yukon. And literally, there is one cord feeding us. So if there's a dodgy backhoe operator in Fort Nelson, we can get severed off and be this little island. So redundancy obviously would have to be in place, and I think that would solve our fears.
Satellite.
True, expensive though. But.
Absolutely, but as a backup, when you don't use it on an everyday type operation.
Mm-hmm. It's just people's hesitance on the cloud, that's all, and that explains a bit of it. People are.
Understood.
Yeah, but they're putting in a redundant line from Inuvik back down, so that'll give us 2 feeds.
It's good that you're thinking through these issues, though.
I did see a comment online too that trying to convince people of the cost of security up front versus the cost of failure after something bad has happened is something that you can present to whoever you're trying to convince.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure, and this is why I think why Peter earlier mentioned, get a line item in your budget to plan and to put this framework into place so that it is being addressed, and you identify as part of some overall studies and reviews what it actually take down the road, what it will take down the road to get to a very comfortable, secure situation.
Well, and I think that it was also mentioned earlier that these aren't like rules that we have to follow, and kind of I think that this originally the presentation was around what are our rules, and the fact that we don't have any is a major gap within Canada as a whole. Is that's something that we should be looking at, and potentially our industry should be pushing for in order to make that a reality, to help protect us, to help our governing bodies ensure that they're following the rule of law in order to help make it a non-issue. Also, it's the same as as like we were saying, for me right now as the owner of a utility, I have to have a barbed wire fence that's so high because I have to meet regulation. I have to have an alarm system. I have to have a noise alarm system if somebody breaks in. There's all of these things that we have to do to protect ourselves. And if somebody goes through those processes, they actually get charged with a terrorist attack. And we should be doing the same thing around our cybersecurity as well, and putting that into some sort of law as well.
I'm really glad that you said that, Krista. You know, at least in the United States, right, there's this debate on regulations, and there's a lot of pushback from industry saying, you know, these things are too sort of burdensome on industry. And that's where, you know, I've sort of come in and say, I think we really need to reframe this debate. It's not pro big government versus pro business. This is public safety and health, and how you know, we can really secure our society and make people safe. So I'm glad to know that that's your thought there too. So thank you.
And I think a lot of this is related to common sense. I really do. I think that we all in general know that, for example, the use of USB sticks is not necessarily good. It's one of the biggest culprits for spreading viruses. And I think that it's good housekeeping for anybody in an operational environment to not plug in a USB stick in your SCADA host. I think we know that, but therefore it's not a big deal if that becomes a regulation, because we already know that. And there are so many of these different angles. So my point is that the word regulation may scare a lot of people, but at the same time, a lot of these things that we're going to find in a regulation are already everyday common sense type practices that we already do.
Absolutely. So I want to read one quick comment, and then I would love to go to the panel again for their final thoughts, you know, whether it's, you know, pulling on any of the threads that we talked about today, or just sort of like a parting thought for people in the audience. But I think this comment is pretty salient. Just a review for the cybersecurity in a developing countries such as Albania. Recently, 1 week ago, our government, local and central government databases had an attack, and every local and central service was down. Listening to all this is very helpful discussion, and it tells me that I should speak to my municipalities that rely on third parties, and you know, that it's not always the solution to actually rely on third parties. The level of security must start at the bottom, start small, of the organization, and then move up to the government, and of course measures should be taken. Now we are discussing proposing some legal measurements and regulations to secure the data of our organization. So, I mean, I think that's, you know, testament to the kind of impact, you know, especially Bart, as you were saying, these conversations and making people think about this and think about the impact. So I appreciate the comment on that. I think that's a good way to sort of sum this panel up. But yeah, I'd love to go to each of you for your final thoughts, Krista, Mark, Bart, and Peter.
I think it all does sound really scary because the boogeymen are out there, you know, but it can be dealt with. There's actual technology we have available to us today. It just needs to be implemented. So it's just coming down to brass tacks, and hey, let's reach out to the resources that are necessary to get these things done. Just take that first step and starting to do it.
I recall years ago when there was operational meetings and safety became a regular topic of conversation. And at first that was awkward. It was weird to talk about safety because was it even necessary at the time, right? I truly believe that we now are at the point where safety is a normal topic of conversation when you have an operational meeting. And even if there is nothing pressing or urgent on the go with regards to safety, somebody will stand up and talk about, pick a subject. It doesn't matter, your fall arrestor or any certification. It doesn't matter, but somebody will touch base on some safety related item because it's become a normal topic of conversation. And I encourage everybody to add cybersecurity to your regular operations types meetings and to start talking and to treat this as a subject that we're going to have to raise to the next level, just like we have with safety.
Technology evolves. So we're moving forward for a more high-tech equipment and stuff that we use to operate our utility system. And there's no stopping that from happening. So in terms of that, as Bart said, educate yourself, open communication, and that's the way you could deliver that to your leadership team. And always, in a municipality, leadership team always asks for the reliability of our system. That's the way you should address it to be able to get that buy-in from the leadership, that we need to do something as technology evolves.
I think for me, just including our internal IT and our external suppliers is going to help that conversation, because then it won't just be me going to my leadership, it will also be my IT support that can help support our need to get protected in more ways than just what they do in the office.
Right. Well, I just want to thank everyone. I know this was kind of strange with moderator coming in from the East Coast, but I think this was a really great discussion. I have some points that I'm taking away from here, so I'm so happy to learn from all of you as the experts on the front line. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a great rest of your conference.
All right, even though Lauren's leaving us, we're going to continue the conversation for a few more minutes here, if that's all right with everyone. What I thought we could do now is share, if some of you are willing, what some of your organizations are doing around implementing cybersecurity policies and procedures, and what kind of base training they're providing for yourselves and your staff. At the District of Squamish, our leadership has implemented a mandatory cybersecurity training program. And it's kind of fun because they've actually pitted departments against each other. So each week or each few weeks, you'll get an email with a link, and you get a login to your department's site. You have to complete some cybersecurity training. It's usually kind of 5 to 15 minutes in length, and it's just what I found. At first, it was kind of like, okay, just another pain in the ass I got to deal with, but after going through a few of these sessions and leveling up my own knowledge, because I'm by no means a subject matter expert in cybersecurity, I've really found it to be useful, and it really drew my attention to kind of my blind spots in my day-to-day with how I handle my passwords and handle my phone, and not only in my personal life, but also my professional life. But it's great because I can see as a manager which of my staff have completed the training modules and who hasn't. And then my department is assigned a score based on the people's completion of these modules, their scores in the tests. And then the other thing that the program sends out is tests. So the company will actually send you phishing messages that are false, that's generated by the security company, but they're testing you to see how you react to these phishing emails and texts. And that impacts your department's score as well. So if your people are trained up and they're responding favorably to these tests, your score improves, and our CAO can look at her dashboard and see where people are failing in these tests and go after them to improve their score. So I thought that was very unique and a good program to be involved in. And if anyone else would like to share their experience, we welcome your input.
Mike, again, you just love this microphone.
I think one of the challenges is not everyone's comfortable in the cyber world, and not every operator is comfortable with a computer. Some staff are extremely good with electronic stuff, and so dual authentication is a non-issue, no problem, click here, sign in there, use your cell phone, boom, you're in. Other people go, what? Like, I can't, no, I don't want to do that. And so that's a challenge for organizations. I didn't know there's a training set up like that, and I really like that. I'm going to suggest that to our organization back home, because especially the fake emails, I think that's pretty clever, actually. But yeah, so, you know, that I could see that, like in the crew I work in, that's exactly a problem. Half the crew are really adept with and comfortable in the computer world, and the other half are like, hey, I'm not paid to do that. I'm paid to do this, you know, and yet, so they tend to not use the system to its full power because they're afraid of the cybersecurity. Like that it's like, no, it's too complicated. It's too, you know. So I don't know what the solution is for that, but you know.
I don't know either. But it's a very common thing, and I think that if you look at technology rollout, there's always the two aspects, and one is that human factor. And it can sometimes even be bigger than the technology itself and implementing the technical solutions. But the human aspect is huge. So, but again, you know, if I go back to this whole topic of safety, it slowly needs to grow. And I think that we are still missing that when it comes to that cybersecurity thing. I think that from a cybersecurity perspective, I have the sneaky suspicion that a lot of people feel that it's crammed down some people's throats and our throats, and immediately as a result, your back goes up and it's not necessarily adopted. But if we change the approach a little bit and open up these conversations, I think that will really help in the actual rollout.
We have two comments online that are in the similar vein, so I'll read both of them. The first one is just a comment saying, my limited understanding is that potential threat would come from an unknown or unapproved use of a personal device. An organization-issued device has greater limitations put on its authorized use. IT doesn't provide coverage for personal devices. They do provide for work-issued ones. I think we're all in the same understanding for that. Yes? The other one is actually having to connect a personal device, which I'm personally finding amusing. One operator says he had 0 Wi-Fi yesterday at the workstation, so he was grateful that he could connect his cellular device and the network to be allowed to view the conference and get his CEUs. The contractor shared that he was hesitant on the cloud initially, but then said he'd learned to trust it, so they gave me that reassurance too that it would all be okay. And now he's back on Wi-Fi and can view the conference just fine. Yeah. So just 2 comments from online. Does anybody in the room have anything else to share?
All right, everybody, we'll give you a little bit of an extra break then. Just want to thank Peter, Bart, Mark, and Krista for their expertise and their time today. And we'll be back at 3 o'clock for the final session. Oh, was that a question or just a stretch? Okay. We'll be back at 3 o'clock for our final session of the day. Thank you, everyone.